When you put food inside of a canning jar, that changes the environment that it lives in because you're pulling a vacuum, you're taking the air out of the jar, and that creates a different environment. And if there's some bacteria left in that jar that did not get rinsed or peeled off, then it might have the opportunity to grow in that type of environment. And you really want to reduce the risk as much as possible.
In Kansas, canning season typically begins in June and continues throughout the growing season. Harvesting garden produce at its peak freshness and canning as soon as possible produces the highest quality product. However, preserving food for later use requires a number of steps. On today's Sound Living, tips for safely preserving homegrown food. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. K-State food scientist and coordinator of the university's Rapid Response Center, Karen Blakesley, says that checking canning equipment, inspecting jars for cracks or chips, and purchasing new lids are key steps in the process. Karen, it is that time again when we're starting to think about food preservation, and we really start always with just checking your equipment.
Absolutely. You want to make sure everything's working right before you get in the middle of the project and find out something's not working right. So if you got jars from last year or years before, absolutely jars can be reused. Just make sure they're in good condition, that they don't have any scratches on the sides of them. Always check the rim of the jars, make sure they're perfectly smooth, no nicks, cracks, or anything, because the seal won't hold if there is any damage to the jars. Plus, if they have scratches on the inside, they could break in the canning process, and then that creates a whole nother mess. And the rings that hold the lid onto the jar, make sure those are in good condition, too. They do get rusty over time, and then it makes them harder to get on and off. But they can be reused. One of the best things to do with your rings is to wash them by hand. Don't wash them in the dishwasher because they rust faster. So keep that in mind. Always use new lids. Never reuse the lids, the metal lids. They're not designed to be reused. And that's because you've already got an indentation in the sealing compound and you've probably bent it when you take it off the jar. So those lids are only used once. I talk about this part of it because we've had a lot of problems in the last couple of years with supply and demand of jars and lids. And that supply and demand is back. And there really should be no problems finding any kind of supplies in that respect. The next thing you really should pay attention to is your canning equipment. Make sure it's in good condition, especially your pressure canners. If you have specifically a dial gauge canner, we can test those dial gauges, but there's only 4 brands that we can test. Local extension offices have the ability to do this. So we can test Presto, National, Maid of Honor, and Magic Seal. There is another brand called All American that also has a dial gauge on it. That particular canner is actually used like a weighted gauge canner because it also has a weighted gauge on it. That is what you need to be paying attention to. The dial gauge on that particular canner is there just for information and for you to know when the pressure is built up and when it's gone back down to 0, so you know when you can take the lid off. The newer styles of the All-American canners have a weighted gauge on them, and that's how you run that canner, based on that. If you have an older style of an All-American canner, you may have a valve stem on that lid that can be replaced with the weighted gauge. So get those dial gauges tested because you want to make sure you know how accurate or inaccurate your gauge is reading. If it's 1 or 2 pounds off, you can adjust based on that difference, but you really should get a new gauge just to be on the safe side. The other thing to check on your pressure canners is if yours has a gasket on the underside of the lid that helps form a seal between the pot and the lid. Want to make sure it's pliable, doesn't have any cracks or dried out or anything because then steam's going to leak out. You're not going to be able to get the proper pressure. And also check the overpressure plug. That's a rubber plug. Those can be easily replaced. Contact your company or there's online suppliers that sell a lot of this stuff. And there's some hardware stores that sell replacement parts too. If you've got a lot of hard water buildup inside the canner, you can heat it up with some water and use some cream of tartar or vinegar inside of there and let it heat up. Also, during the canning process, pour, I just call it a couple glugs, roughly about a quarter cup of vinegar into the canner water on all your canners, and that'll help keep them nice and clean, and your jars will be nice and clean on the outside too, and you won't get that white cloudy residue on the outside. That's all a part of taking care of your canners, and that helps them last a long time.
Yeah, a lot of it is just being familiar with what canner you have.
Absolutely. Read the instructions for your canner. Make sure you know what you're doing. If you've never done this before, do a trial run with just water in the canner. You don't have to put any jars in there. Put the recommended amount of water in there and run it and learn how your canner works with your stove. Now, speaking of stoves, there are certain canners that work better on different stoves. If you have a stovetop that is a flat glass top stove, there are some canners that are not recommended to be used on those because of the weight and the amount of heat, and you really don't want to run the risk of cracking your stovetop. So, for the glass flat top stoves, the only brand of canner that I know of that they say can be used on those is the newer versions of the Presto canners. The bottoms of those canners have an extra disc of metal on the bottom that kind of bumps out, and it fits those burners well, and they sit flat, and they're not as heavy as the other styles of canners. Even your water bath canners, if you have a flat top stove, make sure that your water bath canner is completely flat on the bottom. If it's got the bumpy bottoms, like those speckled canners do, they're not going to heat right. So you really want a big stock pot or a water bath canner that is completely flat on the bottom. There is an electric pressure canner. It's being sold by Presto, and it can also be used as a water bath canner. This is a great alternative to using your stovetop because it's standalone. The best advice I can give you on using that is follow their directions. Don't skip any steps on their process on how to use that. And then also there is an electric water bath canner. It's just a water bath canner only that the Ball Canning Company has put out, and actually they're going to be updating that this summer. And that works really well, too, because it's a standalone canner, and it can be used off your stovetop.
What about in terms of the produce itself? What do we need to be doing? I know one of the things that I've been reading about is making sure that you are going through and peeling certain things.
Absolutely. You always want to start out with the best food and clean food. And there's a lot of produce that when we eat it normally, we would probably eat the peels on that, like potatoes, for example, or tomatoes, carrots. Sometimes we don't peel those, we just scrub them. But when you take those types of produce and you want to can them, if you don't take the peels off, you're running the risk of some bacteria that are hiding in the cracks and crevices of like potatoes and carrots. And bacteria can also stick to the skin of tomatoes, and you can't wash that off or rinse that off with water. You actually do have to peel it. So when a recipe says to do that, it is important. The recipes, and again, we also recommend using, our tested recipes, and I've got a lot of resources on my website on where to look for those kinds of things. Follow their directions. Don't skip any steps on those. You want to end up with the best food possible, because if you start with bad food, it's still going to be bad food. And this process doesn't improve things. So do take that step. I know there's an easy way to peel tomatoes and peaches, for example. You heat up some water, bring it to a boil. Dip those tomatoes in that hot water for about 60 seconds or so until you start to see the peels pull away from the flesh. Take them out, put them in ice water, and the skin should peel right off. And it's really easy. And then you don't waste so much of the flesh.
I think you raised a good point. What we end up with is what we start with, right? If we have good produce to begin with, we're going to have a much better product at the end.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because that's what you want to have. You want to have good, safe food after canning. When you put food inside of a canning jar, that changes the environment that it lives in, because you're pulling a vacuum, you're taking the air out of the jar, and that creates a different environment. And if there's some bacteria left in that jar that did not get rinsed or peeled off, then it might have the opportunity to grow in that type of environment. And you really want to reduce the risk as much as possible.
We also want to make sure that we're cooling things down kind of in an isolated area when we're done.
Yeah, when you're done, you want to set them on a clean towel. What I like to do is put a towel down and put a cooling rack on top of it. That way you get some air circulating all around it. You don't want to set them directly on your countertop because that could cause heat shock. And keep them out of a draft. You know, everybody's got their air conditioners running, but try to keep the draft away from those jars because you want them just to cool down naturally. Don't force cool them, is my point on that. So keep them away from the draft, keep the fans away from them, and let them cool. Separate them, set them apart a little bit so they got some room to breathe and let the air circulate around them.
There's probably a number of ways to do this, but we want to make sure that we know when we canned this product?
Absolutely. Put a date on there. If nothing else, put a month and a year. And actually, the lids that you buy today, they actually have a little space designated on the lid. It's a line, a dash, a line, dash, line. And that's to help remind you to put a date on those jars so you know when you did this. And that's important because we do recommend that you use your canned foods within 1 year. Now, theoretically, they should last longer than that. But a phrase that I've kind of been using lately when I talk about this is you're not putting them in a museum. So use them up. You've put a lot of work into this and use them, enjoy them, and try to get them used within a year. That way you get them rotated out, and then you're ready to restock your supply next year.
A lot to think about. And one of the things I wanted to mention is the fact that Kansas State University, and you are a contributor to the North Central Food Safety Extension Network.
Yes.
And really, basically what we talked about today is all included in different publications.
Yes, this is a group of 12 states in the North Central region, so it goes from Kansas up to North Dakota, over to Ohio, and back down through Missouri. And we've been a group since about 2016, and our goal is to try to create a unified voice on what we're saying and to create some publications or webinars or whatever kind of information we think would be useful so that we're all saying the same thing. And so we do have a website. It's actually on the Iowa State website, but if you do a Google search for North Central Food Safety Extension Network, you can find it. I'll also have these linked on my website. But we created 4 new publications so far, more to come. One of them talks about lids called Put a Lid on It, talks about which ones to choose and how to use them. We also have one talking about jars called Jar It Right. So again, talking about the type of jars to use for home canning. Then we have one on pressure canning for using a pressure canner on a stovetop and the electric pressure canner that I was just talking about. So we've got some information in that one. It's called Pressure Can It Right. And then the last one is about steam canners, and it's called Steam Can It Right. See our theme that we've got going here?
Do it right.
Exactly. So steam canning is something that's been around. We haven't been able to really recommend it because we didn't have research to back it up. And our friends up at Wisconsin did some research on using a steam canner, and it's an alternative to using a water bath canner. And it just creates steam. There's no pressure involved. And it uses a small amount of water in the canner, and then it creates a hot, steamy environment inside the dome that covers the jars. The one limitation on using this is it can only be used with water bath canning recipes that have a total processing time of 45 minutes or less. So take a look at those. I'll also be putting those out on my social media on Facebook and Instagram here in the next month or so you can access them that way. My handle is KSRE Foodie. I put out a lot of stuff on those 2 things, and not just food preservation, but a lot of other things too.
That's Kansas State University food scientist Karen Blakesley with information on home canning and food preservation. If you have questions, contact your local county or district extension office. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.